Hi, this is Ms. Wong, and we are taking notes today on homologous chromosomes. You should have a note sheet from class that will help you take notes on this presentation, or you can take notes on a blank piece of paper. All right, as a quick review, we should remember from our previous units that we've been talking about genes as sections of DNA that code for particular proteins in organisms. We also have encountered particular traits that are determined by several genes, like fruit fly eye color. We learned about the protein network, which was a network of enzymes, which of course are coded for by the genes in the fruit fly's DNA. We've also learned about traits, which are genetically determined characteristics or conditions, and we learned that traits can be physical, like eye color, or metabolic, like the ability to digest lactose, or behavioral. We've learned that although all of your cells have about 6 feet of DNA in them, that DNA can be organized into structures called chromosomes, and that the chromosomes have then that genetic information, the DNA, that's passed on every time a cell divides through mitosis. Let's also remember that the information flow in cells goes from DNA codes for proteins, and proteins then determine traits that we have. So here's the new information. We've been talking in the past about how chromosomes contain genes that code for proteins, and we've always in our models shown one chromosome that has a gene on it that codes for a particular protein. Well, it turns out that actually we have two genes that code for a particular protein. In other words, we get two genes for every trait because we get one chromosome from mom and one chromosome from dad. So each pair of these chromosomes has the same genes. You can see on this picture that the chromosomes are ordered or organized in pairs. So there's chromosome number 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. But for each chromosome number, there are actually two chromosomes because one's from mom, one's from dad. Then down at the bottom of the picture, you can see that there are two X chromosomes. So you know that this is, or these are the chromosomes from a female. A pair of chromosomes, in other words, that pair of chromosomes that has the same genes, is called a pair of homologous chromosomes. You can see on this picture that there are two duplicated chromosomes, and those two chromosomes have the same genes on them, indicated by the colored bands. So this is a homologous pair of chromosomes. And you can also see that if you look at just a single one of those duplicated chromosomes, that it's actually two sister chromatids that are attached together in the center at the centromere. We've learned that when the DNA coils up into the chromosome structure, that we can also say that chromosomes contain genes. And genes are at predictable locations on those chromosomes. So for example, on human chromosome number 7, scientists have discovered various genes that are located at particular spots on that particular chromosome. So what we can say about homologous chromosomes is that it's a pair of chromosomes, and one is maternal, or from mom, and the other one is paternal, or from dad. They have the same genes in the same locations, but we say the alleles may be different. So we'll define alleles in just a minute. If you look at this picture of homologous chromosomes, it's a pair of homologous chromosomes. So the yellow chromosomes came from mother, and that's a duplicated chromosome. The blue chromosomes came from the father. Again, that's another duplicated chromosome. And you can see that both of those chromosomes have a gene for eye color. Now, it could be that the gene for eye color from the mother was the gene that codes for blue eyes, and the gene for eye color that came from father is the gene that codes for brown eyes. But both of those genes are still coding for eye color proteins. So let's define what an allele is then. An allele is essentially a version of a gene. So, for example, there's a gene in fruit flies that determines the abdomen color of fruit flies. So the trait is abdomen color, but the alleles, or the options for abdomen color, would be the yellow allele, which would yield a yellow abdomen color, or the black allele, which is a gene that would code for black abdomen color. Like I've said before, a cell always has two alleles for each gene. One allele is from the maternal chromosome, and one allele is from the paternal chromosome. The interactions of these two alleles is ultimately going to determine the trait that we see. In the example that you see in this picture, there's a pair of homologous chromosomes that have not yet been duplicated. So these are unduplicated chromosomes in a single cell. There's an allele for purple flowers on one chromosome, and there's an allele for white flowers on the other chromosome. So you can see that the gene is the flower color gene. In this example, well, how would we know what color the flower might be? It would depend on the interaction of the two alleles, which we'll talk about later. Let's do a couple more definitions here. So there's genotype and phenotype. The genotype is the combination of genes in an organism. And we usually indicate letters for genotypes. And a letter represents an allele, or a version of a gene that's on a particular homologous chromosome. The way that we represent genotypes could be, for example, big A, or big A, or little a. The big and little letters represent the versions of that particular gene. The entire genotype is going to represent the combination of genes in an organism. If the alleles are the same, then we call this homozygous. So for example, if an individual has big A, or little a as their genotype for a particular trait, then we say that individual is homozygous for that trait. If the alleles are different, then this is called heterozygous. And heterozygous is always a big letter and a little letter. In other words, big A, little a, which means that they have one type of allele for that particular trait and then a different allele for that trait in the other homologous chromosome. We've learned about traits, and now we're going to refer to traits as phenotypes. So phenotypes are visible traits like eye color that are determined by genes. So for example, in fruit flies have a particular trait of eye color, and there are a lot of different options. So there are a lot of different types of eye color that fruit flies can have. They can have red eyes, they can have white eyes, and we've learned about some other eye colors in class like sepia, scarlet. Those are all phenotypes of fruit flies. So let's talk a minute about dominant and recessive traits. So you may have heard these words before when it comes to genetics, and now we're going to define a dominant phenotype as a phenotype that shows up in an individual when that individual has either one or two dominant alleles. So for example, red eyes is a dominant phenotype in fruit flies. And a fly with red eyes is going to have the genotype of either big R, representing two alleles that code for red eyes, or it will have the genotype of big R, which means that they have one allele that codes for red eyes and one allele that codes for white eyes, but the phenotype that we see, or the visible trait, is still red eyes. On the other hand, recessive phenotypes show up with individuals that have two recessive alleles. So for example, if we see a fly with a phenotype of white eyes, then we know that they will have the genotype little r, because they have two recessive alleles, or two alleles that code for white eye color. So we can also use those terms dominant and recessive to refer to alleles. Dominant means that if the allele is present in an individual, that trait always shows up. So for example, if a fruit fly has a big R, or a gene that codes for red eye color, then that fruit fly will have red eyes. Recessive means that the trait for this particular allele will only show up if two copies of that allele are present in the genome. So a fruit fly will only have white eyes if it has two of the white eye alleles. Finally, I should note that only some alleles are dominant recessive. There are, we will learn, some alleles that have what we call incomplete dominance, meaning you'll actually show a mix of both traits if you have both alleles. This isn't present in fruit fly eyes, but if fruit fly eye color was an incomplete dominant trait, then if a fruit fly had a red eye allele and a white eye allele, then the eye of the fruit fly might be pink. So this is the end. Be ready to discuss in class what are homologous chromosomes and why do we have them? What's the difference between a gene and an allele? And you're going to want to be able to give some examples of these. And then finally, how does this information help us understand why children might look like one or both of their parents? If you need to, jot down some of your ideas on these questions and be ready to discuss them in class. Thanks.